This is your friendly neighborhood author, Jonathan, and you are listening to Season 4 of the Floor Rejects podcast, The Wells House Phenomenon. Okay, alright. Welcome, I guess, to the inaugural video version of this podcast. If you're coming from the Floor Rejects, you know my voice. You're used to it by now. I'm sorry for that, but it is what it is. I am your friendly neighborhood author, Jonathan. It's very odd looking at a camera. It's going to be even weirder reading on camera. I don't know how this is going to work. I just thought I'd diversify. I've been gone for a couple of weeks getting some work done for this podcast, not on this body, because we're doing great and you can't see most of it anyway. So we're going to kind of catch up for a minute, and then I guess we're just going to hop into the regularly scheduled podcast. If you're just listening to this, I think I'm recording over here, which for you is over here. I'm recording over here a separate audio track, and then I'm also recording you on your own audio track. So in theory, I can just kind of take this audio, which I've seen other kind of narrative podcasts do, where they just take the audio from the video version and put it kind of separately as a video medium. Oh my god, I'm having a stroke already. As its own, audio format. So that's kind of what I think I'm going to do, subject to change. I don't really know. I do know that it is incredibly distracting looking at myself, even though I put myself as close to the camera as possible. I'm going to have to get used to that. I apologize if it's not perfect. Ooh, I got a ring light. Let's see if I look good. Okay, we're going to turn that off for now, I think. I'll color correct later on. Ooh, I got a text from my boss. My boss is texting me an hour after I finished work for the day. That's great. Okay, we're back. Crisis averted. I didn't really avert the crisis. I don't really care what goes on. She really just keeps texting me, and I'm just going to ignore it because I've spent all day working, and this is me time. I've got to stop looking at myself. I keep looking at myself. I wonder if I could just it's not important. So, here we are. This is the inaugural video version. If you're listening, just listening, I'm looking at you recording version of me. And nothing has changed, really. I told you about the format changes in the teaser for this season, but this episode will be kind of the only one of its type where I'm just kind of explaining what's going to go on, and then from here on out, the first segment will just be a recap of what we listened to last week. Hopefully, when you listen to this or when you're watching it, you heard my new intro music, and you'll hear my outro music that I had professionally mixed by an audio engineer in an attempt to feel more professional and like I'm not screaming into the void for no reason. I've also been working on this story that we're going to be reading, and it's exciting, it's fun, it's interesting. I've said it all before, I'll say it again. I like what's going on with this story already. It is a complete departure from kind of what I've done before, in that it's an adult writing about an adult not coming of age, not coming to terms with who you are, just being gay. Hello. But I'm excited. I'm really, really excited. I think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be a little spooky. And I think the video version of this might kind of change as time goes on, just depending on my skill level, because the last time I edited a video for YouTube, I was like a sophomore in college, and I thought I was going to be the next YouTube star. I thought I was going to be like, at that time, who would it have even been? Like Joey Graceffa. That dates me a little bit. But that's not important. So let's get comfy, okay? Because we're just kind of gonna read through it. This video version is just a companion to the audio version of this podcast, the Floor Rejects podcast. This is season 4. Seasons 1 through 3 don't have video versions. I guess I could go back and do that if people wanted that. But let me take a few minutes to plug some things, and then we'll get into it, okay? So number 1. We Just Call It Love, which is from season 1 of the Floor Rejects podcast. It's a full-length novel. I finished editing it and putting it into a manuscript. I've sent it to Amazon. It's currently available as a Kindle ebook. If you're not into Kindle ebooks, be patient. I'm working on a cover so that I can upload it to Amazon, even though Jeff Bezos is the devil, so that I can have a paperback version available for print on demand for anyone who wants it. So that'll be coming soon. I'll let you know when it's officially out for in-person print release, and we'll deal with that. Number 2, I am so excited about the audio that was designed for my intros and outros. I contracted 2 different people. So I contacted one person to do my intro and my outro, and then I contacted a second person to do my background music. Because if you've listened to the first 3 seasons, it's really not that much. It's not that great. It's not terrible. I'm not recording underwater with a hand mic or anything, but it's nothing spectacular. And my intro and outro sounds that I got from, I think his name was Christopher, because there was 2 people. They are fantastic. He got exactly what I needed, exactly what I wanted. As for the background music, it's good. It's not the person that I worked with on that one, he didn't charge very much, so I'm not super particular about it. It's not my favorite thing. It's not my least favorite thing. I think I might be able to kind of tweak it a little bit because it's a little light, a little bit airy for what we're dealing with. Ooh, I just caught sight of my eyes. That's not good. I don't like seeing myself. This is why I didn't do a video version the first 3 seasons. But so we've got some new music. Hopefully you like it. I really like it. I think it's fun, and I hope that you heard it at the intro. I've already been talking for 7 minutes, so we don't need to talk about everything. You guys don't want to catch up with me that much. So now you kind of know what's going on. You can also go to my website, which is jrlcreations.com. Thought about making another website for the Floor Rejects, but it's expensive maintaining a domain, and I already have one. So you can go there, jrlcreations.com, and you can kind of see blog posts, artwork. As I post more and more content, it'll be available there. And then with the video version of the podcast, I'm kind of caught into 2 worlds because, my first thought is, how am I supposed to close caption something that's generally just an audio format only anyway? I don't know. And I don't mean that disrespectfully at all. I just don't know if that's something that's applicable. Do you know what I mean? So we'll figure that out. I might just try doing the auto-generated captions because this isn't so much just talking off the cuff the entire time type of thing. So maybe auto-generated captions will be good enough, and I'll just post the transcript or the manuscript or the text in the description so you can read it. Very much like 2008 YouTube vibes when we were all making stories and then putting them to music on YouTube. Really, honestly, a precursor to the modern day podcast, but I digress. I don't know. Let's see where this goes. We're going to jump into chapter 1 right now. Before that though, something else very interesting. Because I'm doing a video version of the podcast or video content, I did want to just do some other things, kind of in the same vein, but not necessarily exactly the same as what I've been doing. I was thinking, and it's silly to me. I was thinking about maybe doing Sims content, which sounds strange. But I know when I read a book or I kind of process a story, I like to have visual representation of what's kind of in the story. And especially in this story, you'll figure it out pretty quick, but there's a lot that's going to be going on that's a little bit more visual. And so I was thinking that maybe if I do Sims content, not just like, oh, look at this gameplay, but mostly just using The Sims as a tool to create representations of the people that we're talking about, and the people in the story are subject to kind of change in appearance as the story progresses, as well as the main structures, we'll say, in the story are also subject to change. I thought that might be interesting. So I think that'll go up on the YouTube version of the podcast as well. So if you're just listening to the audio version, maybe check out the YouTube version, which is the Floor Rejects on YouTube as well. You'll be able to find it. It should be very, very hopefully simple to find, because searching that specific term is nothing pops up. So hopefully it's easy to find me that way. But without further ado, let's jump into Chapter 1 of this new story, Chapter 1 of Season 4. And this story is called The Wells House Phenomenon. Enjoy! Now, Alexa, it's podcast time. Isn't that fun? If you're just listening, you don't know what just happened, but the whole room turned red. Anyway, let's get into it. Woo! The Wells House Phenomenon. Chapter 1. A Rude Awakening. It was 3:17 a.m. when Warren Wells reached out, fingers skittering over his bedside table, searching for his phone in a mess of old beer bottles, food wrappers, and soda cans to silence it. It was 3:19 a.m. when he sat bolt upright, phone pressed to his ear, and felt the immediate burn of tears in his eyes. It was 3:31 a.m. when he nudged the sleeping form next to him, a man whose name he couldn't quite remember, and told him to leave. The man, whose name was possibly Ted or something like that in Warren's mind, looked at him as if he had grown a second head and confusedly began to dress. Warren paid the man no attention as he left with the slamming of a front door, not concerned as he listened to the quivering voice on the other end of the line. It was 4:42 a.m. when Warren Wells turned the key in his broken-down 94 Acura Legends ignition, willing it to start. As it did, and he carelessly threw the vehicle into reverse and out of the parking garage of his apartment complex, he could already feel the anxious buildup in his chest, the anticipation of walking to the front door of his mother's house, knowing he would see her, sitting in her favorite wingback, crying, and that he would have to go to her, comfort and console her, all while ignoring the anger she still inspired in him. He didn't hate her, but he didn't want to see her, not when he needed his own peace to grieve. And as the clock passed 5 a.m., then 6 and 7, as the sun crested the mountains he drove towards, his heart was beating like a racehorse around a track. The highway was desolate this time of morning, and in the middle of nowhere. Warren was tapping his fingers nervously against the steering wheel, listening to the static in between stations as the little orange fuel pump on his dash lit up. He cursed quietly under his breath, knowing he should have stopped earlier to avoid seeing anyone he might know, now only a couple of minutes outside of his hometown. He was mostly sober by the time he pulled up to the gas station at the edge of town, and he counted himself lucky that there was only one car in the small lot as he climbed out. The air was crisp, the last bite of winter before spring settling into the heartland, and just as the attendant flipped the close sign around, Warren walked in, squinting under the harsh fluorescence. He dug into his pocket, fishing out his wallet, and pulled a crumpled $20 bill from it. "Can I get a pack of, whatever's cheap, and the rest on pump too?" he asks, the sound of his own voice grating on the otherwise silent store. "Sure thing, hun," the matronly mid-50s attendant says, tossing a soft pack of cigarettes on the counter and turning to the register. "Thanks," he mutters, and as he turns toward the door, hand already pushing out, the woman clears her throat. He turns. "You're Martha's boy, right?" she asks. Warren fights the shiver that runs down his spine. "Yeah." His tone is cooler than he intended, but the woman didn't seem fazed. "I'm sorry for your loss," she says. Warren nods awkwardly and ducks back out into the cold, the warmth of the morning sun on his face as he waits for the gas to finish pumping, reminding him that there were still some pleasant things left in the world. He was only a few minutes from his mother's home, and he lit a cigarette even though he knew she would scream at him for it, and that he would probably smell like it as soon as he walked through the door. He didn't care. The nicotine hit him hard, his eyes becoming unfocused and his head swimming as he rolled through the silent streets of Paisley, the small Kentucky town he'd grown up in. Most of the houses were small, ugly, boxy things, constructed of cheap materials, adorned with sagging AC units and broken concrete paths, and Warren hated looking at them every time he came back. It wasn't that he had a problem with the modest houses, but it was the complete lack of effort that the whole town seemed to suffer from that disgusted him. Almost every house he passed by was overgrown with broken kids' toys, crushed cans, or car parts scattered across the crimpy yards, sometimes a composite that only made him more intent to get out of Paisley as fast as he could. He drew to the end of Lyle Street, turning onto Taylor Boulevard, his family home staring down at him from the hill it sat on. Its windows were almost taking on the shape of slitted, suspicious eyes, following his car as he drove through the gate and up the winding driveway towards it. The Wells family had been in Paisley for generations, each set of children growing subsequently more and more dependent on the family name to survive. Warren's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, William Patton Wells, had settled in Paisley, a successful businessman with a string of boarding houses dotting the East Coast from Maine to Kentucky and eventually all the way out to Colorado before he died. He'd lived in a massive plantation house on the outskirts of the town, and the shell of that building still stood on some farmland in the family, the massive skeleton refusing to bow to nature over centuries. Every generation since had compounded on that wealth, eventually moving from the boarding houses to oil and natural gas as boarding houses fell out of favor to hotels. These days, the only true Welleses left were Warren, his mother Martha, her horrid sister Mary, and Mary's daughter, Tanya. Tanya and Warren were only a year apart, and had spent many forced holidays together, but from the moment he had turned 18, Warren hadn't spoken to any of them except his mother when he had to, and his grandpa Barty, the man he was here to bury. Bartholomew Atticus Wells III was born in 1928, a baby born in the Great Depression who only watched what it did to the people in town, and never felt its wrath for himself. He grew up with as many silver spoons as he could ask for, but he never understood what he did to deserve them. From the time he could walk out to the road on his own, he would be found giving as freely as he could to the neighborhood strays, the hungry kids in his schoolhouse class, and as he grew older, their parents and grandparents. Barty, as he became known around town, was as charitable and selfless as his predecessors had been greedy and self-indulgent. He brought Paisley back after it was rocked by World War II, and it was single-handedly responsible for keeping most of the families in town fed and housed. Often he paid their rent anonymously, or would leave small care packages on their stoops. He was universally loved, and the day he married Grace Callahan, a factory worker's daughter from neighboring Smith's Grove, the whole town turned out to congratulate them. They had been cut from the same cloth, giving only love and help to those they saw, and asking only for more time to help those in their community in return. Grace gave birth to Mark in 1963, Martha in 1967, and Mary in 1972. A late-in-life mother who loved her daughters fiercely. She taught Martha to look out for Mary, and Mary to look out for Martha. Mark, unfortunately, had died as a boy, thrown from a horse while practicing his riding at the original Wells house. Grace chose not to let the death overtake her life, and instead, she threw herself into loving her daughters even more. They were inseparable trios from the start, never fighting like most mothers and daughters do, likely because of how kind Grace was. And they were the picture of modern familial glory, growing to be their own loved pillar of the community, separate from the family name, and solidified as they grew older together in Paisley. It was in 1994, just a year before Warren was born, that Grace suddenly fell ill, doctors quickly finding that she had spots on her lungs after being rushed into the ER with shortness of breath and blood in her coughs. She fought it, but at her age she could not do much but continue to grow weaker and weaker. The day after Warren came screaming into this world, in the same small county hospital where his entire family had been born, his grandmother died, in the same building, only a floor below him. She hadn't had the strength to go to her daughter's bedside, as desperately as she'd wanted to, and so Martha brought her newborn to her mother, laying him next to the woman he would never get to know, but who already knew him from one look. According to Martha, Grace chose his name, Warren, after her own brother. And then, as Martha held her hand and wept, Grace slipped away. Barty used to tell his grandson that when he came into the room a few minutes after, he swore he saw his wife leaning over their daughter, looking the way she had as a young woman, rubbing her daughter's back, looking down at her own broken body before fading into thin air. From then on, Martha grew more and more distant by the day, trying and failing to raise her son, often pawning him off on his grandfather as she ran off with Warren's father to some exotic locale and did her best to escape her grief. Mary grew reclusive and bitter, only coming to see her sister and nephew after several drinks, often propped up by her young daughter, Tanya, who knew only a life of caring for her mother, because Mary blamed her father for her mother's death and refused to speak to him or let him see his granddaughter. Her reasoning was flawed and based on speculation, telling Bartholomew that his smoking had killed Grace, conveniently ignoring the fact that Grace herself had smoked for decades. Warren didn't mind being with his grandfather. In fact, as a kid, he preferred it, staying with his grandpa in the little travel trailer out on the farm, parked next to the rotting corpse of their original familial homestead. Barty had gifted his massive in-town estate to Martha after Grace had died, telling her that he couldn't stand not hearing his wife's voice in the halls. Young Warren loved practicing shooting cans or playing hide-and-seek within the rotting walls of the mansion, or sitting on his granddad's tailgate, listening to him tell stories about his childhood, picturing the town below them as it used to be. When Warren was 15, Bart left suddenly, not saying anything to a heartbroken Warren as his equally clueless mother rang for months with no answer. But then one day the phone did ring, and Warren heard the deep, gravelly voice of his grandfather from the kitchen. He went running, listening in from around the corner. Bart told Warren's dad, named Todd, that Bartholomew Sr., Warren's great-grandfather, had just died, and that Bart was going to be gone for a while to clean things up. Warren had been shocked. He had no idea that his grandfather, who he'd never met, was still alive, and now dead. He had listened to his parents discuss this in the formal dining room that night, after he was supposed to be asleep, and discovered that his great-grandfather's death and life had been a surprise to them as well. He laid awake in bed for weeks, wondering when his grandfather, his best friend, would be coming back. Bartholomew III never returned to Paisley for more than a couple of quick visits again. When Todd was struck and killed by a drunk driver a few years later, Barty showed up to the wake, standing silently in the back of the room, only moving when he rushed to catch Martha as she collapsed on the closed casket. Warren had rushed to his grandfather's side then, completely unbothered at leaving the wake early. His father had done nothing but abuse him since Warren had been old enough to know he was any different and try and say so. When they'd gotten Martha home and in bed, Barty had stayed around only long enough to tell his grandson how deeply sorry he'd been not to be there for him, and when Warren asked him to stay, he only sighed, patting his grandson on the shoulder before walking out the door. Now, back in the current day, as Warren flicked his cigarette out the window, he smiles to himself, remembering seeing his grandfather for the last time the previous Christmas. He'd been home for exactly one night, and that's all he could promise his mother. And when his grandfather walked in the door, Warren unashamedly ran, almost knocking him over with the force of his joy. His grandfather, now weaker and somehow smaller, had laughed, telling Warren that they would have some scotch and catch up later. And Warren had to fight the urge to follow Barty around, watching him from a distance over the edge of his glass, making sure the old man wouldn't disappear again. His grandfather made good on his statement, and that night, in the freezing Kentucky air, they sat on the truck tailgate, drinking and talking. They talked for hours. Timidly, Warren had skirted around, coming out to his grandfather, but after a few drinks, he told him. The balding, jolly-looking man looked down at his grandchild for a moment, leaving Warren shaking from the cold and fear before bursting out laughing, wrapping the young man up in a bear hug. "You have always been special, War. Always told your mama that. Remember, that's what makes you different, and it makes you strong, son," he told Warren. And even now, as his shitty car sputtered and died under the front portico, Warren was misty-eyed. He walked in the dark, silent house and made a direct path for the small sitting room at the rear where his mother liked to sit and read her magazines when he was little, and where, in more recent times, she'd taken to sitting and staring at her TV all day. "Mom?" he called out as he walked towards the back of the house. He thought he could hear her voice, but as he got closer, it was her sobs that he was really hearing. As he rounded the corner into her room, he saw her, draped over the arm of her chair, her graying blonde hair frazzled and splayed out on the arm as she wept. "Mom! Hey! I'm here!" he said, as he pulled at her, hoisting her small body up into the chair. She looked at him, her bloodshot eyes bouncing back and forth, searching his face as if she didn't recognize him. "Warren, I wasn't expecting you today. I'll call Rosalind, and I'll have her—" she starts before another sob racks her. "Mom, you called me," Warren says, squatting in front of her. "I did? Lord, I can't get myself together. I'm so out of sorts." Her voice is small, and Warren can't help but empathize with her. She may have been a subpar mother, but the loss of someone as wonderful as his grandfather had softened him in the moment. "Stay here, and I'll get you something to drink," Warren instructs her, and she nods emptily. He runs to the kitchen, pouring her a glass of sparkling water, but as he turns around to take it back to her, he almost knocks over Rosalind. "Little Warren, I did not know you were coming down," the long-time live-in maid exclaims, and she pulls him into a tight, familiar hug. He'd always liked Roz, but at the moment he was so emotionally shot that he just stood there, a glass of water in his trembling hand. She pulls back and looks at him. "I'm so sorry, Warren. I know you and your granddad were thick as thieves. Are you coming to the service this afternoon?" she asks, and Warren steps back in shock. "Today?" he squeaks incredulously. "Yes, I thought you knew. Did Miss Martha not tell you?" "Goodness, I swear I'd just rather keep my foot in my mouth. It's in there so often. Is that glass for your mama?" she asks him, and he nods. She pulls a flask from her pocket, tipping a clear liquid into the cup. "Take it to her, and I'll go freshen up your room. I'll steam your suit. Hopefully it's still the right size," she says, looking him up and down before hurrying back to the service stairs. Warren follows her instructions, taking the glass to his mother, who drinks it greedily when she tastes the alcohol. He sits across from her, the light of the TV the only thing illuminating her tired, swollen face. "The service is today?" he asks, a quiet rage in his voice. His mother stops the theatrics, the shaking and glassy eyes. Yes, I was so distraught I just forgot. Well, you see, your cousin Tanya, she's been in a bit of trouble between that and your grandfather. I guess I just forgot to tell you," she says, taking a deep drink. Warren shakes his head, laughing bitterly. "Forgot to tell me. Yeah, I'm sure." His tone is biting, and his mother perks up, leaning towards him. "Well, I am not the only person in this family, Warren Bartholomew. You could have called. Then you would have known sooner." Her voice grows higher and higher. The southern belle in distress pretense dropped as soon as it was no longer convenient. "Right, Mom. I got it. What time should I be ready?" he asks, anger giving way to frustration. He should have known. When had she ever thought of him before herself? "Well, service is at 12, St. Paul's, then graveside. Then, of course, the get-together afterwards here at the house," she says, smiling, like at the thought of all the attention she would get, he thinks begrudgingly. "Fine. I'll leave after the graveside," he says, walking from the room before she can protest. She loved having him around, the gay prodigal son returned to stand by her side for things like this. He was just a trendy purse to her. He drove her to the service in her ridiculous SUV, all the while her flipping between bereaved daughter and half-drunk guilty mother. He ignores her for the most part, helping her from the car, making sure she doesn't stumble on her way to the front pew. He sits next to her, seeing Mary and Tanya at the opposite end. They don't smile. In fact, Mary scowls at Warren, or maybe his mother. He isn't sure. Tanya stares blankly ahead, not looking at anything other than the casket. The service is long, drawn out, and largely infuriating. The entire town seemed to be lined up to speak in favor of old Barty, as they called him. So much so that eventually people were speaking as a separate line ran past the closed casket to pay respect, just so there was time to bury him. Warren didn't bother. His grandpa wasn't in there. He was just gone. The burial was almost as bad, with the entire graveyard filled with people, crying, turning to each other, hugging at the loss of Warren's grandfather. He couldn't imagine anything other than grinding his teeth and waiting for it to be over. He drove his mother home in silence, happy to get there before anyone else, praying his car would start so he could go home. When he walks in the front door, a strange but vaguely familiar, good-looking, distinguished older man is standing in the front hall. "Mr. Wells?" he asks as Warren helps his mother through the door, rolling her eyes as she grasps at him and stumbles drunkenly to grip a nearby credenza. Uh, yeah, I guess that's me. Who are you?" Warren questions the man, perturbed by his seemingly unaccompanied presence in the home. "That's Mr. Fitz. He's the family lawyer." Martha slurs, and as she lurches into the formal sitting room, Warren moves to follow her, but she waves him off. "Mr. Wells, I have some paperwork for you to sign if you don't mind following me." He begins walking down the main hall, not waiting for Warren, and Warren just makes a small indignant sound and follows him into his grandfather's study, which is tucked away down the hall in a large alcove. As a child, he hadn't been allowed in the room, and as an adult, it only reminded him of the man he often felt abandoned by. The room was a cherry wood-paneled room, covered in bookcases. A large executive desk and chair sat in the rear center of it, flanked by two tall, narrow windows, a pair of high-backed chairs in front of it. It was a dark room, musty from disuse and filled with the energy of powerful men past. The two men stand awkwardly for a moment, Mr. Fitz assuming that the young man would sit in the desk chair, and Warren feeling too uneasy to do so. So they sit in the two chairs across from it, leaving the actual desk and chair empty, the faded green velvet curtains barely drawn enough so they can see. The room and all of its furniture was heavy, and it felt to Warren as if it was pulling him down, breathing around him, willing him to stay put, under the control of a family that was almost completely gone. Mr. Wells, I have here your grandfather's will. He wanted me to read it to you first, in privacy, before I shared it with your mother and the other family members," Mr. Fitz says, and the younger man nods, leaning forward, eager to hear what his grandfather has to say one last time. "Okay. Warren, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I left you, and I'm sorry I could never tell you why. I know I told all of you that it was because of your great-grandfather, but that was only a half-truth. As I write this, and likely until I died, I'd been at the Wells house. It was the first of the old family boarding houses, and it has since become the last one standing. I did not come here just to see my father, or to bring him home. In fact, he's buried here, on the property, as is his father, and his father's father was, and so on, and as I will be. The casket buried there in Paisley was empty. I cannot explain why, and it doesn't matter. What I have to tell you is this. You need to come here, to the original Wells house. It's always been tradition for the firstborn, always a boy in this family, to take on the property when the last generation passes on. It would be your Uncle Mark's turn, but he's already here, buried between your great-grandfather and the plot where I'll be interred. I know you won't want to, with your life in the city and all the fantastic plans I know you have for your life, but this is how it has to be. Mr. Fitz will fill you in on the details, but just know that you will not be dumped here with no way to survive. The generations before you have made sure of that, but you must come here as fast as you can. The house cannot survive long without its master. You are that master now, War. I love you, and remember what I told you that night after your dad died. It's not the typical advice the new housemaster receives, and I can't write it down here, but I need you to remember it, because it will make all the difference." At the conclusion of the letter, Warren leans back, his hand clasped in his lap, and feels a single tear slide down his cheek, falling and soaking into the opulent green embroidery he sat on. "Mr. Wells, Mr. Fitz begins, but Warren shoots him a look. "Just call me Warren," he says, annoyed at being called a name he didn't care about. His grandfather had insisted that he carry on the family name, instead of his father's last name, but now he could care less whether he was a Wells or not. "Okay, Warren. The original Wells house is in a small town in West Virginia named Elkins. It was the first boarding house built by your family, and it seems that—" Mr. Fitz is interrupted when Warren stands suddenly, moving angrily to the window on the left side of the desk, his face furrowed as he looks out at the sun setting over the edge of the city. People would be arriving soon. Mr. Fitz, I appreciate you coming by, but I'm not doing whatever it is that my grandfather wanted me to do. I don't really care if that's what he wanted, or what the men in this family do. I'm not doing it. Warren's voice is full of frustration, sadness, and pain. He'd always wanted his grandfather back, and if not him, at least a good explanation as to why he was gone. But this letter was not either of those things. Warren, can I at least tell you the rest of the information about Wells House? Mr. Fitz asks calmly. He was used to dealing with irate, entitled kids. Warren flips a hand rudely at him to continue. All right. The Wells House is in Elkins, West Virginia. It is a 14-bedroom, 11-bathroom estate. It's 4 floors with several outbuildings. It sits on 375 acres that your family has acquired bit by bit, and it also comes with its own trust. Mr. Fitz pauses, and Warren looks at him, failing to conceal his now interest at the prospect of money. He also knew that the way entitled kids would react when trusts were involved, and so he continues, smiling down at the paper at the predictability of the upper class. The trust is, and this is in your grandfather's words, a modest $550,000 per year, in perpetuity, as long as the family businesses can provide it. There are stipulations, however. Do you wish for me to continue? Mr. Fitz already knows the answer as he looks up and sees Warren, now turned towards him with his hands on his sides, nodding. Here are the ground rules for caretaker of the Wells House. The caretaker must live within the grounds of Wells House. It does not have to be within the manor itself, but within the boundaries of ownership. The caretaker of the Wells House must also not leave the property for more than 2 days per year. The caretaker must not bring non-family members onto the property. The caretaker must maintain the property and provide for staff to keep the house and grounds properly maintained. No permanent structures can be built on the property. Updates and renovations should be kept to a minimum and authorized by the groundskeeper on staff. The caretaker must be within the property line before midnight every night and be on site for a minimum of 6 hours per day. Otherwise, it will count as one of 2 off-site days per year. Failure to follow these instructions will have consequences as outlined in the caretaker's instructions below. Mr. Fitz finishes, and Warren is laughing to himself, his hands planted on other sides of the desk opposite him. So I have to live alone, no visitors, in a giant house with $500,000 per year, and all I have to do is make sure it doesn't fall down? And I get the money, I don't have to share it, I can just dole it out and live there? The previously angry, now shocked Warren looks to Fitz for confirmation. The older man nods, oddly solemn, but Warren ignores it, sitting down now behind the desk, a small smile creeping over his lips. Hand them over, Warren says. He had always hated frivolous relationships, and the only reason he wanted to return to his apartment so badly was to be away from his mother before he even had a chance to see her this morning. Without the aggravation of being near her, being completely isolated felt almost ideal. No more rent, no more broken down car, no more work. He could care less about living in the city, and when he had the pen in his hand, he was happy to sign his name to the paperwork. As soon as it was done, Mr. Fitz scrambles to pack his cachet up, and Warren looks out the window, seeing a parade of cars with little purple and white flags heading up the hill towards the front gates. He shudders, and as he turns back to thank Fitz, the man is already gone. He never heard the door open, and he never hears the massive front doors shut. He looks down at the expensive-looking fountain pen, RMF, inscribed on the side of what appears to be an antique pen. He pockets the thing, holding on to it out of a strange sense of memento, thinking that maybe this was the start to getting to know his grandfather again, maybe better in death than in life. He steps out of the office, the darkness swallowing the room once more as he shuts the doors with a decisive thud, looking for Roz to ask if she'd seen Fitz out, but he finds small groups of mourners filtering in. It isn't as hard for him to muster a fake smile now, knowing he was about to live an idealistic life in solitude, with money to burn, and so when people started to come up to him, and his mother, as she doddered up behind him with sunglasses over her bloodshot eyes, He appears more genuine and forthcoming than he had in years, so much so that even his mother takes notice. She had an unclear understanding of what he was meeting with the lawyer about, but she took solace in seeing him happy, or at least less angry, even if it was at her expense and the death of her father. He was smiling as he laid down on his childhood bed that night, still smiling as he fell asleep, his eyes closing as he looked at the small table next to his head, his plane ticket for the next morning glowing in the moonlight, almost unnaturally, the first token of his new life. Okay, I'm back. This is the first time you're seeing me say that in person. Let's maybe turn up the brightness a little bit so you can see me. We're going to keep it spooky in here because I like it and because I think it's flattering. I really like this story. I'm really excited. I'm so excited. I know I say that every time. If you're from the audio version of the podcast, you know I say it pretty much every time I write something that I'm excited that I like what I wrote, which I think is a good thing, because if I didn't like what I was doing or writing, why would people ever want to listen or watch or whatever? But I'm really excited with the premise of this story, with the kind of design of the story, how it's going to play out, because I already have it mapped out. The way that season 3, that Drapple kind of went, it went off the rails, and I didn't have it planned out. I didn't have a clear idea as to what the ending was when I started. In this case, I have a clear ending. I know what's going to happen. I know where Warren's going to end up. I know what he's going to find or not find, what's going to happen to him. And I know this chapter was a lot of exposition. It's a big setup to a not so exciting ending to the chapter, I guess. But that's what first chapters are kind of about. They're not always the funnest, most wild and crazy adventures for the character. Sometimes they are, like in We Just Call It Love. That one kind of starts off with, well, it literally starts out with a bang. But this one is going to get really good. Even in chapter 2, which I've already written, in chapter 3, when you would still think that a lot of it would be exposition, you start to get that eeriness. And I was watching, what was I watching the other day? Oh, I was watching this scary movie, and I don't remember the name of it, but it's about this guy that gets like a terminal illness. He's diagnosed with some sort of terminal illness, and he goes to spend all of his time in the forest. The movie itself was not really that good. I think it was just like a huge allegory for him running from his own death. Blah, blah, blah. White men really saying what needs to be said. But what I liked about it was the moments that were so eerie, so tense, is what I want to try and figure out how to capture in writing, which sounds stupid because people have done it. I want to figure out kind of how to do it for myself. And like one scene in particular, he's asleep in this tent, and the camera is kind of set up so that you kind of see him sleeping in one corner, but most of it is just the gray side of the tent. And then gently you see someone from the outside poking into it and kind of reaching to touch him and then letting go and then doing it again. And it was so eerie. It makes the back of my neck, it makes me shiver. It was so eerie. And that's what I kind of want to figure out how to put into a story, because the only stories I've read that truly scare me or that make it hard for me to sleep at night or freak me out are honestly nonfiction stories. The most recent one being I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which is about the Golden State Killer, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker by Michelle McNamara. I highly recommend you read it. It is fantastic and frightening. But like a horror movie that isn't, or a story that's meant to scare you, that is fictional, is kind of hard to, for me at least, to imagine how you write that. How do you create that sense of dread, of heaviness, of nervousness in the person reading or listening? I don't know. I don't know yet. I guess I'll hopefully figure it out. But I think this story is going to be fun. Even if I don't succeed in this will be my first draft, really. I'm kind of reading it to you, and maybe someday if more and more people hear this or watch it or listen to it, there can be feedback and discussion going on so that the people who are reading it and listening are kind of almost collaborating or giving me critique, sort of. I mean, like, don't be mean to me, but if you have an idea, I'd love to hear it. Because maybe I'm desensitized to scary things because I watch so many scary movies, or, I mean, you can see her. She's beautiful. She's right here, my beautiful Annabelle, whomst I know and love so well. Oh, and my favorite murder is also back there. I don't really watch Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling can choke. That's my boyfriend's, so just ignore that. But I want to figure out how to do that because I love horror movies. I love the idea of scary stories, of scary books, like reading scary stories to tell in the dark as a kid. I loved that feeling, and I want to create that as an adult when the things that are scary to us oftentimes are just too real. Like, they're things like the death of a loved one, or like, not to be graphic, but like assault of many kinds. That's very scary. Or like, the police are very scary, but not often are we scared by, in reality, things that we can't see. We're not super scared of things that go bump in the night, other than the assumption that they're people that are going bump in the night. I want to figure out how to make a story that you read that scares you without it being a person, because people are scary enough. I want something that's scary that's not real, or that hopefully is not real. I've been talking for a while. This is my first go at video podcasting, at being on a camera, because that was never really my intention. Then I got some feedback from some of my friends who were like, listen, when I want to watch a podcast, I don't open up my podcast app. I don't go there and to find the podcast and set it up so that I know when they're coming out. And that's what I do, but I work all day, every day, either at a desk or in my car. So I can kind of have that schedule. A lot of people kind of just want one centralized area. And I think for people now, more and more, we're shifting towards like YouTube, which is fun. It may not be your top quality video editing. It may not be perfect, but you'll still get the same content. It just might be delivered a little bit differently. So that's what I'm excited about in this chapter. Next week, it's going to be a little bit more character development, a little bit more of figuring out where Warren is really going, and once he gets there, kind of establishing a baseline. Kind of like, things will be subject to change in this story. That's a big part of the story. But because we're doing this, or I'm doing this as a third-person narrator, things can change for Warren, and the narrator can still be aware of those changes. The reader or the listener can still be aware of those changes. So next week, we're going to be establishing that baseline and kind of getting a hint of what that means. I don't know. I'm excited. Like I said, if you want to listen to previous stories that I've written, you can listen to them on my podcast, just the audio version, The Floor Rejects. It's the same name as what you're watching right now, on any podcasting app. I think it's on like 11 different podcast apps or stations or whatever now. So you can listen to it there. If you want to take a look at some of the things I drew, like I drew some of these the other day, which, I mean, might get me demonetized showing them to you, but oh well, they're literally drawings. Like, I draw like little line arts, can you see? Like line arts and things like that. Like little sexy line arts. Because, and I've talked about this in my previous, like, these are just little things I just kind of sketch out, and then I'll upload them periodically onto my website. But I love the idea of flipping the male gaze on its head, because if this is the first time you've tuned in, basically the male gaze is the way that we, as a society, from kind of like the dawn of patriarchy, have put women or feminine bodies into this like hypersexual, disposable, consumable form in art, from statues to paintings to books and movies and TV shows and pictures. We consume women in this way, and I like to draw things or create things like stories in which men are that focus, not necessarily to demean them, because I think that sexuality or that understanding yourself in those terms is not a bad thing or something to be ashamed of, but to kind of, I don't want to say give men a taste of their own medicine, but kind of to give men a taste of their own medicine. And I don't know, kind of let them understand that it's not so bad, because like, not to be brave, not to say brave and controversial things, but like, I was on TikTok the other day, and there's kind of two schools of thought with hot and sexy men who show their bodies on the internet. Half of them are like, I don't want men to consume me in that manner, and then the other half of the men are like, consume me all you want, I don't care. Personally, I like to consume men in the second way, in which they are willing participants in the consumption of their bodies, or that sounds awful, the consumption of the media that they put out with their bodies is the focus. I don't necessarily really subscribe to feeling really bad for men who are objectified on the internet, because I don't feel bad for men in general. Yeah, I stand by that. I don't feel bad for men in general. We've had enough time. But I digress. I like the idea of kind of putting the masculine body, the male, I don't want to say male body, but the masculine, or the more stereotypically male body into art in a way that sexualizes them, or that celebrates them in a way that I don't think men or masculine bodies really have been historically. I mean, like, you can think about things like the Statue of David. I mean, that was more a display of power in the time. When you look at the context of when that statue was created, it's a masterful sculpture, it really is. But that was a display of power. That entire statue is a display of power. But like, when you look at the way that I draw things, or the way that I think that I draw things, that when I draw them, the way that I like to look at them is there's a piece of masculinity in there, or that typical, and also, if you're listening to this, I'm talking to when I look over here, I'm talking to the audio only people. If you're listening to this, I'm just showing pictures of things I've drawn. You can see them on the website. Video listeners, if you're new here, that's the sound of planes flying overhead. Audio listeners, you've been here, you know. But I like to consume content and create content in that way that flips the male gaze, or flips all of the roles that we're used to. Like, I used to talk about the Harlequin romance novel, in that it was always a bodice ripper. It was always a woman on the cover, her breasts out, you know, a man shirtless, just there to save the day, with large pecs and rippling muscles, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that, but why don't we flip it on its head? And I also got some feedback that maybe I'm a little bit too niche to reach a wider audience, which is one of the reasons I've thought about diversifying a little bit, which I think part of that will be when I go and make Sims content, but it's Sims content centered around what I'm already doing. Again, just a companion piece to what my main focus is, which is the stories that I write. So I'm going to stop talking, because I've been talking, and I think, oh God, it's already 8:30. I think I'm going to try my hand at recording some Sims content, maybe, and it'll be a first draft. I think maybe I'll just start with Warren and give him kind of a look, what he looks like. Again, as we progress through the story, things are subject to change, not necessarily just people, or not necessarily just places, but things in general are subject to change. And while it seems stupid, or like maybe I could draw it, I'm not very good at drawing faces. I'm not very good at drawing anything other than men's butts and chests and butts. And legs and arms, but faces I can't do. Houses, landscapes, things like that, I'm not really that good at. So instead of trying to draw it and like failing at that, I can kind of use the Sims as a simulation of what these people look like, what these places look like. So as that plane flies over, I guess I will. Oh my God! Wow. It sounds like it's just going to crash into the roof. As the plane flies over, I will, of course, say goodbye to you for this week in this format. I will say goodbye to you for Chapter 1 of the Wells House Phenomenon. As I've said in every season in the past, looking at you, audio-only listeners, and also now looking at you, video watchers, video listeners, I appreciate you being here. I really do. If you want to give me feedback, you can tweet me at The Floor Rejects on Twitter. I don't have any followers there. I have been posting on there for about a year now, and that's fine. You can email me at thefloorrejects@gmail.com and let me know what you think or what you don't think or what you'd like to see or maybe an idea for how I can diversify this sort of content into other avenues that aren't The Sims 4. But The Sims 4 is what I know. It's what I love. Regardless, talk to me. I would love to hear from anyone, anybody, about anything. If not, I'll be back here next week. Same time, same place, same red room, which hopefully, it looks really pink on my screen, so hopefully I can color correct it because it is like blood red in here. But I'll be back next week. Hopefully not wearing a hat because I didn't do my hair today. Probably should have, but I spent most of the day doing this so that it didn't look like I was squatting in here. But until next week, I have been your friendly neighborhood writer, author, podcaster, Jonathan, and this has been the Floor Rejects Podcast. Bye.